Home purchases. The role that family financial support contributes. Hi, my name is Sonya Fields, and I am a student at San Diego Christian College. And this is the final presentation of my capstone for 2014. But first, before we get started, I'd like to pause for a word of prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, Lord, we just come thanking you and praising your holy name for this day. For this is the day that the Lord has made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. Lord, I thank you for the opportunity of me being able to present this presentation to those who will be watching, and I pray that it will be pleasing to your sight. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. Home purchases and the role that family financial support contributes. That is the title of my particular capstone. The analysis of this particular paper will focus primarily on the factors with regards to the differences in blacks to whites in their education, their wealth education, and the economic gap between the two races when it comes to purchasing of a home. The hypothesis for this particular study is that white Americans have a distinct advantage over those in the African American communities who do not have at their disposal the financial backing in contrast to their counterparts when it comes to assisting their kids with the purchase of a home. This research used a questionnaire that was distributed to homeowners of white Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic or other candidates who chose to participate in Atlanta, Georgia. The survey included questions concerning their age, their sex, their educational background, a question specific that if they had received financial support when purchasing a home, specifically from their mother or father or grandparents. The objective of this data collection was to provide a brief presentation for that particular study. The sample of the questionnaire is here for you to see. Again, it had 10 questions, and the questions specifically were age, their educational background, their race, whether or not they owned a home again, and did they receive any financial support from family members. This study involved 22 white Americans, 22 African Americans, and 1 Hispanic other American participant. The investigation of this research took about 6 to 8 weeks in the year of 2014, together along with 3 to 4 weeks of analysis of this data. All participants were homeowners or had purchased a home at some point in their lives. This allowed for everyone who had completed and returned the survey to be involved in the data collection of this particular study. One of the areas that we researched was the education, the income, and the inequality of the occupations that they chose. The background of families have a different effect on the education and occupation of both the minorities and the majority families that were studied. What was found out is that the fathers of each of those races, African American and white American specifically, had an impact on whether or not their kids continued on after high school for continued education. The study revealed that fathers in the home have been known to be the foundation in keeping the family stable, and there is diverse effects on the salaries that their kids would make if they continued their education. It was found that, of course, more African American families have absent fathers, and white Americans have more fathers present, as well as they stress the importance of an education over those of our African American fathers who are in the home. I found out that people who are highly skilled in demand jobs like IT or those that specialize in any financial sector, for instance, saw their earnings rise substantially, while workers with lower and middle skills were left behind or left way below the minimum wage. The solutions to reduce these disparities between races in America are providing more investment in improving education and improving the skills that one would gain with some type of continued education. The achievement and college completion gaps are growing, and this study showed, as family financial resources like income and wealth appear to be large predictors of educational success. The study of the educational gap suggests that neighborhood segregation is a major concern. Of course, what the study said is that for those who live in better neighborhoods received a better primary education before going off to college, with the diverse effect of for those who lived in lower income received lower education or sub-level education, which means more than likely they would not continue on to a higher education degree. Although the national graduation rate was 78.2%, meaning that 78.2% of the students who were freshmen graduated as seniors back in 2009 and 2010 school year. The records show that that was up from the dropout rate back from 1974. The study of the educational gap also lends itself to the fact that neighborhood segregation is a major concern as to the leads to lower quality schools for minority students. In addition, when cost of college education continues to rise some 60% within the past 2 decades, many minority kids decided to get jobs after high school rather than continue their education because of the cost. It was also studied that even though African American kids may have started college, that most times they dropped out because of the expense and were not able to continue on in that pattern. Whereas white American kids were able to continue school because of the support that they had from their parents and grandparents, mentally, physically, and of course financially, which allowed for a higher graduation rate for white Americans. But now let's talk about wealth. The accumulation of wealth is that of resources or material possessions. Some would say that being wealthy is how much money you have, and some would say that it depends on your debts from that of your assets. Do you have wealth? The first is the conceptual distinction between income and assets. While income represents the flow of resources earned in a particular time period, such as a week, a month, or a year, assets are stocks of resources that have been saved or invested. So that kind of explains the difference. It says, does society invest their disposable income, or do they lend support to help those family members in time of trouble? One would say that it is determined by the education one has and the values taught to the child, which is the thought that minorities do not have access to disposable resources more readily so that they are able to plan for their futures. Having an excess of funds depends on a person's occupation, their education, and their income equality. Wealth is a storehouse of family financial resources, and when combined with income, the home ownership, the value of your home, where it's located, your health, your travel, comfort, or security, these determine your stability within your wealth. So wealth accumulation. Wealth emerges from hard work, disciplined consumption, saving, wise investments, and family inheritance. For some blacks, wealth is accumulated through real estate and the purchase of vehicles. I found that in my study that most African Americans, again, put most of their income, earned income, into homes, large and expensive cars, and clothing. Blacks would use the equity, though, from those homes that they purchased to buy additional homes and build what we call rental properties, and they would obtain wealth from that particular pattern. And in some cases, some African Americans would have additional wealth to pass on to their kids and to their grandkids. However, as for whites, they generated their wealth via investments. And there were some particular investments mentioned that they normally put their monies in. And they are certificate of deposits, which are normally called CDs, high interest bearing savings accounts, the stock market, mutual funds, bonds, IRAs, and other types of retirement plans. And most importantly, that I found interesting, was that whites also gained their wealth through family trust accounts. Nowhere in any of my resources that I find where African Americans have received wealth from trust or wills left to them. Although I'm sure there are some that have received wealth, I just didn't find any that supported that. Although, in spite of our investment practices and our spending habits, we do show a record as African Americans, an increase of financial progress. And by that I mean African Americans are purchasing more insurance products, such as life and disability insurance, at equal or greater rates compared to general population. And we know in most cases when a loved one dies, it's a financial strain on the families who do not have insurance. So this particular factor indicates that blacks are understanding how important it is for them to have some type of insurance policy or some type of disability policy to help support the families in case of a major emergency, health risk, or death in the family. But it also shows that white Americans use this method of obtaining wealth as well as ensuring their families are stable by the majority of them always purchasing these particular products. Blacks may not always have extra income to possibly invest because they are known to apply these extra funds to paying down debt instead of investing their decrease in wealth accumulation in stocks and bonds. The obstacles of wealth accumulation was interesting because the study indicated that living in the South, the number of children played a role in the wealth gap between both white Americans and black Americans. Although the most important contributor to wealth and the gap between minorities and white is by far the household income and the value of one's home if they are able to obtain a home. Another obstacle of wealth accumulations are that the black household mainly consisted of parents, adult children, and grandparents. What I found out is that African Americans have extended families living within one home, and therefore their income went to the support of those, which of course was the parents, the children, the grandchildren, and in some cases the grandparents, all in one home. There were some other instances where middle-class black Americans were also supporting their parents who lived outside the home, just because due to cost of living increase, they were at a disadvantage to help their parents and loved ones and not have the opportunity to invest the extra funds, although they were educated and had high-paying jobs. Now, for the statistics of home ownership, I learned that the Equal Credit Opportunities Act and the Fair Housing Act clearly outline practices and behaviors that should be followed to ensure that people of all nationalities were offered a fair opportunity to own homes. But of course, we've discovered that that is not always the case. This study found there were two major financial institutions who were sued and then fined millions of dollars for unfair practices for African American and Hispanic loan practices. In 2002, housing wealth accounted for 63% of all wealth in African American families. The black-white home ownership gap stood at 28.5% in 1996 and narrowed to 26.2% in 2004. Increasing black home ownership and rising home values are optimistic signs of closing the racial wealth gap, but with the unfair practices, sometimes that's hard to achieve. However, the two financial institutions that were fined allow for minorities to be charged higher rates, as well as were given unattractive loan mortgages. And we normally know them by at this point of subprime loans. They were offered those types of loans more often than white Americans, and as you know, back in 2006 to 2009, give or take, is when the housing market collapsed due to these subprime loans. From this particular behavior from these financial institutions, the United States Justice Department has implemented some effects to restrict this type of behavior back in fourth quarter of 2013. Although the housing market continues to struggle, home ownership rates by race and ethnicity from 2009 to 2013 were stable according to the numbers of each race, but the housing numbers for minorities are much lower still than those of white Americans. There was a report that came out by Callis and Kresin, Kresin, back in 2014 that showed that nearly 70% of Americans owned homes at the peak of the housing boom in 2004, but by fourth quarter 2013, nearly 5% of those Americans had lost their home. And according to this study, that took the rates for home ownership back down to 65%, which is where we were back in 1995. Now, for financial gifts for home purchases, I found out that first-time home buyers now have to provide a 10% down payment. You know, like I know, it's been rough for folks to find jobs, as well as to save 10% of a down payment for just a home purchase. With those types of restrictions, we found in the study that the baby boomers have provided their grandchildren and children financial support in the pursuit of the American dream, which is the purchase of a home. There was a study that showed baby boomers are most likely to give money as a gift rather than a loan, or rather than signing for a home loan, more now than ever before. 10% of those baby boomers say they will definitely give their children or grandchildren money as a gift for down payments. 53 of those folks say that they hope to, but it depends on their particular financial situation as to if, when, and how much of their investment or their wealth would they give to their kids. Similarly, it says 6% will loan money to their children and grandchildren for a down payment, and 52% in this study say that they hope to. In addition to this study, I wanted to find out whether or not the effects of financial gifts play any role to whether or not the applicants got approved or not approved. And what I found out is that financial institutions look at gifts received for down payments in two ways. One being that the financial institutions agree that giving monies for down payment is a good thing. Why? Because home mortgage companies feel that these particular families would continue to have financial support in case they became unable to pay their loans. But there's also a second part to that. Mortgage lenders also found that that was a little questionable if families or new couples apply for a loan and receive a financial support from family, is if they question whether or not these families would be able to actually afford the home. So there are some financial effects or some ratings that mortgage companies kind of weigh when they receive candidates who have received funds from family members. This suggests that the transfer of family wealth from home purchases in some cases positively reduce the degree to which marginal households are crowded out of the home buying market. So what they say is that if African and white Americans choose to buy homes more often because they have the financial support, that leaves the market less available for African Americans, of those of us who can afford to buy a home in, say, those upper or middle class neighborhoods. Most of the white Americans will have already purchased the homes with the help of their families, more so than African Americans who may not have had the support of families to purchase homes. It says, overall, the tragedy of race in the U.S. housing market states simply that race does matter. Categorically, nations of racial identity influence the economic, social, and political behavior of individuals and institutions. These are indications that minorities are still struggling to accumulate wealth. This diminishes their ability to provide financial assistance to their sons and their daughters, to access a quality education, to pursue more lucrative occupations, to purchase their own home, and to achieve equal standing with their white occupants, or should I say counterparts. Now let's talk about the data that was collected and how it was collected. I briefly told you earlier that there were surveys that were submitted, and there were 44 or 45 participants. This chart reflects just that stability in regards to what was received. 22 African Americans who participated. Out of that, 4 were male and 18 were female. There were 22 whites who returned their surveys who participated. 19 of them were male and 2 of them were female. And believe it or not, I was able to obtain one Hispanic participant, and that was a female participant who decided to provide their feedback. And educational wise, there was a survey. Of course, the questionnaire provided whether or not these folks were high school educated, college educated, or higher. And what I found out was that 15 of the African Americans were college educated. 1 Hispanic was college educated, and 14 of the white Americans who participated in this study were college educated. That was extremely important, as education was a major factor in whether or not this would affect a loan approval, or whether or not a family would purchase a home, or whether or not they got family wealth from a home. But the most important question here we have is that of those who had received financial support from those who took the survey, the 45 participants. And what I show is that 11% of those who participated, which were white Americans, received financial support from either a mother, a father, or their grandparent. We have 5% of African Americans who participated in this survey who too received financial support from a mother, a father, or a grandparent. And then our only Hispanic/other participant did not receive financial support at all for this particular survey. So for the conclusion for this is the results of this study clearly supported the hypothesis that whites show that they have supported their kids more often than African American families when it came to the purchase of a home. This was conclusive in the data gathered. The education of those surveyed were also predicted to be a factor in how many of these participants received family financial support. However, there was an almost equal amount of participants who were college educated. Therefore, no conclusion could be drawn that education played a major role in the numbers of these families who received or not received family financial assistance who participated in this survey. Although we found that our conclusion was conclusive of the hypothesis, there were some recommendations. And what I recommend from just some of the studies that I was able to research, as well as my own study for the survey, that future research in this area needs to be conducted to address why was it that African American females outnumbered those of African American males who equally rated with those of white American males who own homes than their white American females. I found that somewhat strange, but not odd, that Black American women would be higher in number, if not equal to white American men who took this survey versus those of the white American females who also participated. It would also be especially important to study if the next generation of participants understand the rules of saving and investing. I would love to see a study that shows of all of the participants in the next survey of this type, if whether or not the education of how to invest their monies had either been a factor in whether or not these people received financial income or purchased a home because of the fact they were able to invest and had money to lay down for a deposit or have funds to purchase a home. So again, it would also be important to study if the next generation of participants understand the rules of saving and investing money to ensure a more solid foundation for future generations in their success in being able to provide family financial support for their kids. So as I close for this particular presentation, I would like to say that thank you to a couple of people who have supported me in this effort. And now state, I'm grateful to the members of Greater Fairhill Baptist Church and my pastor, Dr. Patrick K. Lattimore, for allowing me the opportunity to conduct my survey for this course to the members of this church. My gratitude also goes out to management and to my place of employment, and of course to my husband's place of employment, who graciously took the survey. I would also be remiss if I did not get, of course, the thanks from his management team who supported me in this effort. But most importantly, I would like to thank my husband, Minister Robert J. Fields, who lended his support and editing skills to review this document. So in closing, I would love to leave you with this particular quote that reads, "To be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardship." And I quote that from W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks. I thank you so much for viewing this particular presentation, and I hope that you learned a lot from this particular presentation. Thank you so much.